Hello and welcome back. In part 1 of this video, we looked at all the important considerations you had to think about before you started putting your book together. And in this part 2, we're going to work through step by step the best process to avoid all the pitfalls in making your photo book, and we'll be able to demonstrate with one of these photo books that I recently made. And the example I'm going to use is this book I made on Iceland. So we'll start with the first step. In working through this process of putting your book together, I'm assuming that everybody is familiar with both Lightroom and Photoshop, and if you're not familiar with it, I suggest you go and look at one of my earlier videos that shows you some of the basic steps. And for the purposes of this video, we'll be working through initially with Lightroom, and let's move Lightroom over here and let's get started with the first step. And the first step in starting to put together images for a photo book is to make a collection. And more important than that, I'm going to make a collection set. And a collection set doesn't physically contain images on its own, but it's like a folder, or in this case, as the little icon suggests, it's a filing drawer or a box where you would put all of your other collections. And in making the Iceland book, I created a collection set called Iceland Book Images, and to do that, you just simply go to the Collections tab in Lightroom, click on the little plus symbol, and you can see here you've got options. We want to create a collection set, and really helpfully it defaults to a name called collection set, which tells you nothing. And we don't want it inside another collection set. We would just give this a new name and we would create the collection set, and away we go. Now I've already done that, and the second step is to put within that collection set a series of other collections that you might want to draw your images from. Now for the book on Iceland, I had images of buildings, I had various other features around the country, I had some geology, landscapes and water. They were just some arbitrary groups that I made, but the most important thing is to create another collection within here called the final selection. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop images into each of these other collections, and if your book is just on one single subject and you don't have any other subsets, you just need to make an initial collection called call it selection, whatever you like to call it, and then most importantly another collection that you will call the final selection, which is where you will drop your images that you've decided to add to the final group that you're going to analyze and put together for the book. So having created your collection set, you would then go back through your image collection and your folders for the various images and locate. Now there was only one location for most of my images on this one, and that was a trip to the Arctic in 2015 pardon me, and to Iceland. And so I would go through my images in Iceland and pull out the ones that I felt might make the final collection. I'd like to consider for the book. For instance, this one, I quite like that image. We're in our folder within our library, so once we've selected the folder within our library, on the left hand side we scroll down to our collections, and you'll see here the collection set of Iceland book images. This is a buildings image, so I would just simply drag that and drop it into buildings, and then it would form part of that collection. And as you've pulled images into various parts of this collection, you can just scroll through and pull other images in. For instance, this is a landscape image. I might put it here, and it doesn't really matter whether they're processed images or just the raw files that you've picked up from within your folder. Just drag as many as you think are worthy of consideration and drop them into the individual collections. And you'll see here that I've already got a group of images I've called buildings, and this is from a series of photographs around Iceland of various buildings, which are very interesting. I've called one features, which are things that are a little bit don't fit into any other category, such as statues, the old aircraft and various other things. Geology could overlap with landscapes. It doesn't really matter as long as you've got some idea of dropping dragging and dropping images into a collection. I think that's already in the collection, and you'll see here there's different numbers of images. Now, as we know from our initial work in determining the size of our book, we would have a very rough idea of how many photographs we want to put into our book. And so we know that we're going to have here a lot more images than we will ultimately put in the book. And that's the important thing, is to just get initially all the images you'd like to consider into one area where you can compare them. And of course, once they're in this collection, you can drag them around and change the orders. It doesn't matter. And you can put similar images together, so you get a little bit of an idea of what works and what doesn't work, or even compare similar images. For instance, this one and this one are fairly similar. I wouldn't put both in the book. I would choose one or other. Now, one important thing to remember when you're putting images into a collection is that they don't actually get moved or copied. A collection is just like an external reference to where the images are held, a little bit like a shopping list. Whatever exists here only exists in one place in your library, and moving them in and out of collections, or even deleting them from collections, does not remove them from your image library. So as we drag and drop images here, they're still the same image that exists in your library. This is just a way of putting them together in such a way that you can sort them and find them and decide which are the ones that really ought to be considered and which are the ones that probably won't make the final cut for the book. And you can drag and drop and move things around, and look, once you've decided on a group of images, you can go through and compare and say, well, actually this one that I put in, it's quite a nice image, but ultimately it's not going to make the book. So while ever you're working in your collection, you decide you don't want that in the selection anymore, select it, right mouse click and just say remove from collection, and it's gone. But it still remains in your library, so you're never going to delete it. The only way you can delete an image from your library is to delete it from the library folder, and it will ask you if you really want to delete it. But here we're just looking at the collection, as we can then move around and decide which ones are going to make the final cut. And in doing so, what we really want to do is make a fairly critical assessment of which are the ones that are really going to be important for the book, or part of the storytelling aspect of our book. And I've got a number of different ones here that relate to one of the important things in Iceland, of course, is the active geology of the country. And you've got volcanoes, you've got all sorts of thermal areas, you've got extinct volcanoes, you've got steam, and you've got various other geological features. And so I would pick a group of these for the final selection. And that's the next part we're going to move on to now. So once we've added images to our collection for consideration, and we've gone through and we've chosen the ones that we think are the more important ones and discarded those that are too similar, we can then make a really critical final assessment of which ones are going to be really definitely going into the book. And what we would do now is, working through each of these groups, or if you only have one group, just work through fairly critically and pick out the ones that definitely are going to be in the book. And we would then just drag them from this collection and put them into our final selection. And it's important here not to waste time at this stage processing any of your images. If you're still looking through images that are raw files or have not been processed properly, don't worry about doing this now until you've come down to the final selection, because you might end up wasting a lot of time processing an image that really just isn't up to the mark as far as being good enough for the book, and you've wasted hours and hours on something that's not going to be valuable for the book. So don't even think about processing any images at this point until you get to this group where you've made a final selection. Now, my book of Iceland was 60 pages, and there were going to be some pages that had 2 images per page, but then there were going to be things like title pages and index pages. And so I was looking at culling it down to somewhere in the order of 60 to 70 images. And you'll see here my final selection has 70 images in it, and these are the ones that I'm going to consider for the book. And once we've got to this stage of having our final selection, I think that all of the ones here are now ones that have been processed. But if you have images that have not been fully worked up, now is the time, once you've made your final selection, to start thinking about doing the processing of these images ready to then put together for the book. And that's the next step. So having come down to our final selection, which won't be your absolute final collection, but it'll be the ones that are really the very short list that you're going to decide will eventually get to the book. You would now go through and process these images. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the processing steps here because that's subject of other videos. But if you have any images that are not fully worked up files, such as this one, which is still a raw file, you would go ahead and process that, take it into Photoshop and process it as you would as if you were going to save the image and keep it to be printed at home or whatever. And so you would move it from Lightroom into Photoshop and save it out as a Photoshop or a TIFF file. Now, there's one important thing to remember when working within Lightroom and your collection. If you are working within the collection, and if I was to open this file in Photoshop, which we will do now because I've already worked up the processing in Lightroom, we'll go into open this in Photoshop, and if I minimize this, the image will appear in Photoshop. Here's the image. Now, once I've done my processing in Photoshop, I'm not going to do that now, but let's just say we go File, Save As, and what you should be doing is saving it back into the original folder where your raw file came from. Some people like to save them in different folders, and that can get very confusing. But if you save them back into the same folder, you've got the added benefit of being able to locate the raw file, and I'll just call this one Road. Save that. If you are working from the collection, saving this back as a Photoshop or TIFF file, if you then go back to Lightroom, you will see that, as if by magic, still within your collection, the Photoshop file or TIFF file that you've saved from that raw file will now sit alongside it in the collection. However, if you actually access this raw file from the image folder, even though it's the same image, Lightroom will say, well, you didn't access it from a collection, so you obviously don't want it in the collection. It won't automatically add it to the collection. It will just reappear in your folder where you saved it. So it's important to remember, once you've made your final selection and you're going to start processing those images, keep working from within your collection, and the finished file will return to the collection. And then once you've processed the file, you could then remove the raw file from the collection because you've now got your processed file. So having done that, now this doesn't look any different because I've not done any processing on it, but let's say that that was the processed Photoshop or TIFF file. You no longer need the duplicate of it, so we just remove that from the collection, and now you've eventually got all of your processed images sitting here, and you'll see that nearly all of these have been saved as Photoshop files because I've been through and processed these, and they're ready for the next step. So we've now got our images from our final selection to a point where we're pretty happy overall with them. We've done our processing. Now we want to be able to look at them in a way that would be the layout of the book. And there's an easy way to do that, and that's using Lightroom's built-in book module. Now, we're not going to use Lightroom's module to print our book because it's an American-based company, and they're a lot more expensive than you need to pay for a book in Australia. And what we'll do is it's automatically laid these images out into the book. We don't want that. We want to come back and start with the images that we want to put in ourselves. Now, unfortunately, when you clear the book, you come back with just a couple of pages. But what we would do now is, I've already made up an image that I think I was going to use for the cover page, and I've saved it already in here. If I can find it, I think it might have been that one. or something like it. Yes, there it is. And so you just drag it from this film strip along here and drop it in place. And I've already made a title page, which we're going to come to shortly. But let's say that I've got to that point and I'm going to put it in as the first page. So you can see that this is the inside or the back of the book. This is the cover, and then the first thing that you see when you open the book is your title page. Now, in most of the books I've put together, what I've liked to do is not put anything on the back of that first title page. I'll leave that blank, and what I need to do now is to start adding pages and then dropping my images in. And what the beauty of this is that you can drop images in, and I'm just going to drop a couple of images in at random, and you can then get a sense of how the layout will look. And then of course you can drag images around. I don't like it there, I'm going to put it here. You can move them around and add images to your heart's content. And let's just say, well, I'll put that one there and this one here. Oh, I haven't added a page. The only annoying part of this is that you can't add bulk pages easily. You just have to keep going through and clicking and adding pages as you go. But I want to see how these two images will look together as the book is open. So I can just go down here to the 2-page up view, and you'll see that these images are a little bit large for the book layout, but we can still get a sense of what works side by side. And let's have a look here. We've got a standard landscape book. Depending on which type of book you've selected, these images may look a little bit over large, but we're going to come back and we're going to create the actual pages as a form of checking this later on. But at this point, I'm only interested in getting a bit of an overall sense of the order in which I want my images to appear. And you keep going through and adding them. And let's just do that. Add a page, drag another image in, and so forth. So you can keep going. And once you've got a few images in the book, you can drag them around and decide, well, actually, I don't like that there. I'll put it here. And so you get a preview of how the book will look. And once you get to the point of being happy with it, you can just look at a single page at a time, and you can work your way through and assess how the pages are going to look. These, don't worry about them being too large for the page. This is purely to get an idea of the flow of the book. And the beauty of doing this is that we're still working within Lightroom. We can still move things around. We've got access to our final selection. We don't have to go in and out of other pieces of software at this point in time. The only thing we have to do is just keep adding pages as we go and dragging and dropping our other images in. For instance, these two images would go together because this was the cliffs where the birds were located, and this was the image of the puffin. And so you get an idea of how you're going to lay the book out. Now, it's important to get your overall layout sorted out at this point, because this is going to determine the order in which you create your pages and number them for inclusion in the book. And that's going to be our next section. But this is the important aspect of getting the overall flow of your book and really deciding if this is going to work or not. And it's another way you can decide then, well, I've actually got enough images, and let's say, for instance, we want to add a couple of images to a page where you might have, say, for instance, 2 up on a page. Here we have an image of a vertical image of the church. I want to add something to this. Now I'm just going to move that over, scale it down, add a cell for a photo, and we can then add our other photographs to it. So I've got a couple of pages in the book where there were 2 up verticals, and that really works quite nicely, and I can drop my 2 images there, and let's have a closer look. Yes, I can see that, well, apart from scaling them up a little bit, but they do sit together quite nicely because one's the interior and one's the exterior of the church. And as I said, we're not too worried about the scaling because we're going to sort that out once we get to our template. But the most important thing here is to get the order and flow of your book, because this is your guidepost for putting the pages together, which is the next step. So now we've got our book layout determined, we know which order the pages are going to go in. Now becomes the important part where we create each of the pages for our book in Photoshop. And to do that, we need to create a template. And what we will do in Photoshop, I've already created a template and I'll demonstrate how we do this. And in the first part of the video, we determined that what we wanted to know from the book printer was the size of the page. And if we just go in here and have a look at the size of this image I made, this is an A4 landscape book. I've made a page that's exactly A4 size. And one of the other things we needed to know from the printer was the resolution of their printer. And as we mentioned, if they're using an Indigo machine or a similar device, they're going to want 300 pixels per inch. And so we make up a sample page exactly the size of the page of the book at the dots per inch in the book, and also very importantly, the profile, the color profile. Now this was made incorrectly at Adobe RGB, which is for some book publishers, but what we really want is we want it to be in sRGB, because that's what the book supplier has told us that they want their pages sent to them in. So we'll just convert that page now to sRGB color space. And what we do once we've created this template, we'll also make one for the right hand side page, and you'll see here that I've got a small margin determined here with a guide, and this is a left hand page with a binding on the right hand side, and so I've left a larger margin here to allow for the part of the paper that goes into the binding. And once we've made this template, what we're going to do from now on is, while we're taking our images from our collection in Lightroom, we are now going to save these images into a new folder we're going to create in our library, and this will be the final book pages. So once we've created this, we will go and File, Save As, and I've already done this. I've created a folder within my main image library, and I've called this the Iceland Book Pages, and these are the actual pages we're going to use to drop into the bookmaker's software once we're completed. And you'll see here I've got an A4 page template left hand. I'll just save that, and we would also make a right hand page. And I've also made a couple of other samples. For instance, I've made a 4-up sample page, and this one actually has some images dropped onto it that I've used to work out the layout. And I've also created a standardized form of text. And one of the important things is, when you're putting your book together, keep the text, both the text size and the font type, consistent right through the book. Nothing looks worse than a whole lot of different text that's all over the place. And with this sample page that I've made, I've resized the images to suit, and we'll come to that shortly. But just popping back to our original page template, what I've done is I've determined what margins I want to leave, and in this case I've created a margin of 15 millimeters from the top and the bottom, 15 millimeters from the open edge of the page, and about 28 millimeters from the side of the page that goes to the binding. And to create these guides, it's really quite simple. Go to the Move tool and just click on any of these borders or the grids here, and just drag a line across, and it becomes a guide. And you can locate it, and if you zoom in close enough and move the guide, you can see that you can position it pretty exactly. And what we're doing is we're putting these guides in place to allow us to align our images consistently on the page. And if you create a guide that you don't want, you just drag it off the page and release it. So I've saved this template with the guides in place, and if I go and open my other one, which would be the right hand page, we've got a similar thing. This has got a sample image on it already, and you can see here that I've got the title already made, and it's good to go. I'm happy with that layout. I know that I've got a comfortable margin, given my images a little bit of space to breathe around the edges, and then we're good to go to start making our pages. And before we leave this template stage, most importantly, one of the things that the book designing software is not great at doing is anything to do with fancy text. And you'll see here that I've made a title page for the book, and I've used the text tools in Photoshop to design the text. And the photo book software really can't do any of this. And we'll look at the options of designing text in the next little section. And moving on to part 3 of this video, we'll go through the process of making our actual pages, adding the fonts and text overlays, and then uploading the final proofed pages into the Bookmaker software and sending it off for printing. So please come back and go through video part 3.